Welcome to the Zen Gateway interview. This time we interview Meido Moore, Abbot of Korinji, a training temple based in rural Wisconsin. We recently reviewed his latest book, Hidden Zen, Practices for Sudden Awakening and Embodied Realization, a manual on energetic development in the Hakuin lineage of Rinzai Zen. Along the way, we take in martial arts, the history of energetic practices, koan training, and differing models of mind, body, energy, and spirit. Due to a snowstorm at Korinji during this recording, there is some sound dropout. Hopefully this will not impair your enjoyment of the discussion. Obviously, thank you very much for agreeing to come along to the Zen Gateway and to be interviewed by us, Abbot Meido Moore. I normally look people up on Wikipedia. You don't have a Wikipedia page, but you do have a sort of small biog on the Shambhala publishing page as well, obviously being your publisher, which says Meido Moore Roshi was a disciple of the lay Zen master Tenzan Toyoda Rokaji, under whom he endured a severe training in both Zen and traditional martial arts. He also trained under Dogen Hosokawa Roshi and later under Sozan Miller Roshi. All three of these teachers are in the lineage of the famous Omori Sogen Roshi, perhaps the most famous Rinzai Zen master of the 20th century. Meido serves as Abbot of Korinji, a monastery near Madison, Wisconsin, and is a guiding teacher of the international Rinzai Zen community, traveling widely to lead retreats. Okay, so presumably that's all still current and that's still all accurate, but perhaps just to get the ball rolling, I'd like it if you could just tell us a little bit about your journey into Buddhism, how you came to be to occupy the position that you are, but more just your road in and the influences that have been important to you on this path.
Certainly. Thank you, Martin. And it's really nice to be here with you. I get asked that question quite a bit, and I have no real explanation for it, to be honest. My interest in Buddhism was from a very young age. And I think what kind of led me to it probably was American literature, reading the transcendentalists like Emerson, and they were influenced by some Hindu scriptures and so on. So encountering the Bhagavad Gita, and from that the Upanishads. And then I think there was a day that I had the Dhammapada in my hand, and that was what struck me, and I think made me realize that Buddhism was the interest. So I went on to do religious studies, undergraduate degree at a university here, and during that time I was fortunate to go overseas to India and Nepal with a Buddhist studies program run through Antioch University at the time. Very wonderful program. A lot of interesting people have come through that. And on that program was able to be exposed to various Buddhist traditions and start to really practice. But when I returned to the United States, having been over there in India and Nepal, I found out that I had tuberculosis, so I became quite ill. And at that time, martial arts also became something of interest to me because it was a way to gain my health. That sort of confluence of those two practice paths, increasing interest in traditional Budo or martial arts training, combined with my desire to continue Buddhist practice, led me to meet one of the teachers you mentioned, Toyoda Rokoji, who was a lay Zen master. He was a Japanese Rinzai Zen master who immigrated to the United States in 1974, but he was also an Aikido Shihan, master of that martial art of Aikido. And he established a training center in Chicago, of all places. So when I got out of school, he, I guess, grabbed me. I have to blame him for everything. He asked me what I was doing after school. I said, I like to do Zen. I like to do martial arts. He said, come to Chicago. And it turns out that his training center was, along with being a martial arts training center and a real center for Japanese cultural studies in general, was also a Betsuin or branch temple of Chozenji. And Chozenji is in Honolulu, Hawaii, was the temple that Omori Sogen founded outside of Japan. So Chozenji became the bridge for Omori Roshi's lineage to come to the West, both to the United States and to Europe. Chicago was the center of that activity in the mainland United States. So there I was in the thick of it. I had no idea what Soto Zen, Rinzai Zen, what the differences were, what lineage was what. I just knew that I was attracted to, originally to Toda Sensei, my teacher. But once I landed there and did residential practice there for 7 years, of course I was training with him, but I also immediately began to do Sanzen with Hosokawa Roshi. Hosokawa Roshi is a Moore Roshi's main heir, and at that time was at Chozenji. So somehow by hook or by crook, I landed in the lap of this particular lineage. And from there, just continued my training. At some point, as part of our activity in the West, we realized that a true Sodo, a true monastic training center, and preferably a rural one where we could do some of the important training that we couldn't do in Chicago, like real samu, cutting wood and growing a garden and so on. We knew that we needed that. Toda Sensei unfortunately died quite young at age 53, almost my age now, actually. But his dream before he passed away was to establish that kind of place. So after he passed away in 2001, I set about that work. And by 2014, Korinji, this place in Wisconsin, was founded. By 2017, the final structure was done, and we began the first of our Ango, first monastic training breed. So we've been in full operation for 3 years, and I have the good fortune to be here as the Abbot currently. But that's kind of my path. I look back on it, I really have no idea how it all happened. How it came to be, but a lot of fortuitous circumstances and connections, and of course, we're still riding the energy of those amazing teachers that you mentioned.
Just as a matter of interest, how many people are full-time residents with you?
Right now, 2. We've had as many as 4. Right now, we have 2. One has been here for 3 years from the beginning of its opening, and another who's been here coming up, I guess, on a year now. But those 2 are with me now, and we have certainly a lot more people who come in for events. We have 8 one-week session a year, so we have quite a crowd for those things. Of course, COVID has put a damper on that. But we're set up to have about 6 full-time residents. Small place, humble place. I like to call it a poor country temple. That's what we like it to be. But we'll be nice in the future if a few more bodies are around here.
Well, we'll certainly put a link in the show notes to the website, so that people can see a few pictures.
Send all your problem students to me. Yeah, send all your problem students.
They can come and see what it looks like. I just wanted to pick up on something that you said a little bit earlier about your path in, because obviously we've just at the beginning of this month we had Rahatsu, and I know that it's quite common to tell the Buddha's own life story of up to from the birth to the enlightenment. It's a good time of the year to do that, and of course, it's that interesting mix of as it were inner affinity links and outer circumstances. And it seems a little bit, the people that you met were obviously through your tuberculosis, because you decided you wanted to do something about your health, that actually took you down a certain route. I wondered if, because it's something that does appear in the stories of, that we hear of the stories of the Zen masters as well, about often sort of fortuitous meetings. And I just wonder what your own, I don't know quite how to ask this question, your own view or your own experience on this sort of integration, as it were, between, inner vocation, perhaps we could call it that, and sort of outer circumstances, the role of maybe karma and dharma in the Zen training, in coming into it and also being motivated and staying with it right the way through the process. I'm not sure if that, do you understand what I mean?
I think so. I've felt this kind of, how shall I say, as if a wave has been carrying me since, from a very young age. I guess I was what you might call a religious personality. I grew up Catholic, not strongly so, but lying in bed at night, praying and working myself, I now recognize into kind of ecstatic states. I had that orientation from the beginning. So we can call that karma, I guess. But from the time I encountered Buddha Dharma, and then when I went to India, especially, it was as if one door after another opened without my trying, really as if I was riding something larger than what I could sense. And even when I was there, I had no idea who the teachers were that I was contacting there. I found out much later, these were very eminent people. I got to meet and practice with Anagarika Munindraji, famous Vipassana teacher. Tongka Urgyen Rinpoche, one of the most eminent Dzogchen masters of the last century. I mean, people that I had no business encountering, and somehow I found myself in front of them. So I have no idea how that happened. And then to encounter the people, Zen masters, who became my true heart teachers, or root teachers, so to speak, in the lineage of someone like Omori Sogen. It's mysterious, really mysterious thing. And although there was a lot of hardship, like the sickness you mentioned, connected to it, I can't see it having happened any other way, and I certainly would not change anything. So I guess what I take away from all of that is a real sense of faith, a kind of almost a sense of confidence and surrender that my path has thus far unfolded almost, or certainly in spite of myself, not through any great effort of my own. So we can call that fortunate or good karmic roots, but I'm certainly incredibly grateful.
Thank you. Perhaps we can talk a little bit about the lineage itself, that you, as it were, came into contact with, and obviously had that affinity. How important, before I ask you, about the lineage itself, how important is having that affinity and that connection, do you think, for a student when they meet a teacher? Because there are stories where students will meet teachers, both of them may be very good, have great, the student can have great potential, the teacher can be very eminent, but they don't necessarily resonate. Can that relationship still work, or do you actually have to find the right one?
I think there's always benefit to be had from contact with the Dharma, but it's classically said, I think even Torre may say this, I don't recall where in the text he says this, but if a teacher and a student meet and there is not that kind of affinity, it can have dire circumstances. There's a story about a teacher who inherited the Dharma, a student received Inca from a teacher with whom he did not have the correct affinity and ended up going mad. So,
right.
I don't know if we can always blame it on the teacher, but I think it speaks to what is our conception of lineage after all. I think in the Rinzai way to look at lineage, it's not just a list of names and the people who had relationships. Of course, the human relationship is the pole around which the Zen training rotates. But we speak also kind of kiai, or energetic vibration or match, exist when that relationship is really come to resonate with the sort of energetic vibration of the lineage and the teacher through time. That's what we call transmission. As we often say, it's not that the thing is passed between the two people, but we could liken it to a guitar string vibrating from the adjacent string, causing one string causing another string to vibrate in a similar manner. When that's happening, we can say that the affinity is correct, or that there's a good match. And you can see it. You can see it physically when you look at, for example, the calligraphy of teachers, successive teachers in a lineage. It's not a stylistic similarity necessarily, but you can see that kiai, that energetic quality, is the same generation to generation to generation. That means to me that there was a match there. So I would say it's very important. But that being said, until one finds a teacher with whom that real affinity exists, we should avail ourselves of whoever we can meet, and any contact with the legitimate teacher, any contact with the Buddha Dharma is going to be beneficial. But if we can find that one that we have the real karmic roots with, that's good fortune of an almost inconceivably great nature.
Okay, thank you. Yes, I think that's a very interesting point, and certainly something that comes through, many of the stories, I think, of the Zen masters as well in their wanderings. Just moving on to the question of your lineage, because obviously your own training was very. It wasn't just in a monastery. You were also training in martial arts as well, and certainly from reading Hidden Zen, to my eyes anyway, I think I can see the influence that has, because you put great emphasis on this embodied training, which all Zen teachers do. But do you think it makes a difference if you are involved in a discipline, in an embodied discipline as well? I mean, a little bit what I'm asking is about this thing called the ways. I think, I think they're called do in Japanese, that are distinct from Zen, but they are often practiced by Zen practitioners. How important do you think that was in your own training, and do you recommend that generally to your students?
Well, I guess the first thing I would say, and Zen is often mentioned in the same breath as martial arts amongst people who are interested in those kinds of things. But my teachers were always very clear to say that Zen is Zen, martial arts are martial arts. They're not the same thing. So it's important we don't conflate them. But the emphasis that Moore Roshi made in his practice or in his teaching for his students, because he had a background as a teacher of swordsmanship as well as a teacher of calligraphy. The emphasis that he made was that these disciplines are especially useful for modern people, in that most of us are not living very embodied lives to begin with. We tend to have sedentary lifestyles. Most of us are not going to do extensive training in the sodo, in the monastery, where there's a kind of osmosis or gradual embodiment through the form of that training. So what can fill in those gaps for people? And especially what can give people the real intensely energetic quality that our modern lifestyle may not cause us to develop quite as strongly. So he used what he knew from his background, martial arts. And so I think it's extremely valuable for someone, but I'm always very careful to say that you don't have to do martial arts and Zen. Zen is a fully sufficient path by itself, but because Zen is a path accomplished through the body, because it is, as you said, an embodied practice, you got to get it somehow. You don't get it only through your Zen practice. If you don't, Zen practice and doing manual labor on a farm all day might be enough, but most of us are not doing that. So you got to get it somehow. And if martial arts are not your thing, maybe something else could be. Any kind of physical culture may be a path to that if it cultivates the same kind of body usage and breath usage as the Zen training. And that's one side. The other side is the artistic side. Moore Roshi stressed fine arts as well as physical culture, because we need something also for refinement. And again, in a traditional monastic context, of course, you have the literary study, you have development or practice of calligraphy, you have those kinds of things. Could be tea ceremony, could be flower arrangement, all of those do. But if we're not using one of those traditional ones, what can we use? Maybe you might decide to take up ceramics or woodworking or calligraphy, or even Western calligraphy. Could be that kind of three-part training, the traditional Zen training as the core, but then a supplemental training of a physical culture to really drive the energetic content and the embodiment, and a supplemental training of some kind of artistic endeavor or craft, something where you're developing sensitivity and refinement, and of course, in all of these, cultivating the seamless samadhi and the meditative condition in activity outside from the formal zazen. I do agree. I think Moore Roshi was right in that sort of model, which is very traditional in Japan, has a real use for modern people. And I just want to expand it and say it doesn't have to be traditional martial arts, tea ceremony. It could be so many different things, non-Japanese disciplines, things that aren't necessarily Do. But I think to develop a sort of a complete human being, that kind of approach, I believe really useful. For me, it was necessary. I was an introverted, shy, self-absorbed, self-centered, sort of useless person. Martial arts forced me to be in my skin and deal head-on with conflict. Artistic training forced me to deal with my tension, my stiffness. I could go on and on about these things that have helped me, but I think if I had done only Zen, the transformation would still have been there, but it would have been a lot slower.
You do offer some do's at Korinji, I think.
We do calligraphy here. We also, because I have a martial arts background, I can teach that. Again, it's not maybe something that's suited to everyone, but if someone comes here and they have both the interest and the affinity with it, they can benefit from it. I'll implement that sort of supplemental training for them. And other than that, of course, they're working in the garden and moving rocks. So everyone does something.
Well, I mean, I think that's a very good point about the fact, obviously, we do live more sedentary lives. And I know the classic Zen and the Art of Archery, the Herigel book, of course, he was advised to enter Zen through archery, because otherwise it was probably going to be too big a cultural leap as much as anything else, but also to get him back into the body. And I think it's what is quite interesting, because although I did martial arts years ago, nothing connected with Zen training or Buddhism at all, but I do know somebody who practiced Kyudo, Japanese archery, who told us about the first examination that they actually did in this, and that the emphasis wasn't even on hitting the target. It was about stringing the bow and the form. And I think that, perhaps as a sort of supplementary question, just to sort of tease this point out about it, that it's a real, that when we're talking about embodiment, that we're talking about the forms of things that perform, as it were, rather than I, so to speak. And it's actually making that shift in consciousness almost, and that this is what samadhi is about, to be able to move out of that sphere that I am the one that perform, in the tea ceremony or whatever, but it's the form of the tea, it's becoming the form of the tea ceremony itself. That's what gives it that, I think, what you called refinement, which I think is a lovely term. Would you say that's accurate?
I think you've hit a very important point there. Yeah, it's a very important point. Our training is form. We live in the world of form, of course. And form can be the path to so-called formless through the embodiment or the mastery of it. I think a lot of folks who are initially attracted to Zen are attracted to it because they have sort of an intellectual idea of somehow Zen is very free and released from all limitation and boundaries of so-called form. But then they find out very quickly, no, this is a yogic practice accomplished through the body. And here's the form that you hold the body precisely because it has a particular effect on the mind. And here's the way you use the breathing precisely because of the effect it has. And through that path of mastering those forms, we can arrive at that place of freedom. That understanding is what all of those so-called Do and Zen really have in common. The path of training of surrendering oneself to the form and embodying this is the important part, embodying the principle that the form transmits, because the form itself is not it's just the container, but the principle of body-mind functioning that these forms transmit, that is no different if you're doing Kyudo than if you're doing Zen, if you're doing tea ceremony. That way of training, understanding of training, I think is completely the same. that's where those paths meet. And I guess I was fortunate to have teachers who understood how Zen and how something like Aikido could complement each other. That was a very powerful training form or method for me.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that's really important to bring out, particularly when people are learning meditation. People get very hung up about performance and all this sort of thing, rather than working to cultivate the form. Just as a sort of quick aside, when I was living at the temple at Shobuan, it was at the time of the big earthquake and the meltdown of the nuclear reactor that took place a few years back. And we had a French student who came over. She had to leave. She was working in Japan and took up Zen training in Japan. She never did it in the West. And her teacher sent her back to Europe and asked her to come to stay with us for a little while. And she told us about how she was taught Zazen. Now, when we were teaching Zazen at the temple, we would teach people how to sit down, how to hold their hands, how to keep the back with the spine, in the nice S shape, and then the breath, and then the out breath, and then the count on the out breath, and so on and so on. She was just told to sit down on a cushion like that person over there, and that was literally all the training she got. And she kept at it. I mean, good for her. She did sessions like that. She did whole sessions like that. And she almost gave up. And there was an American monk there who she went to and said, "Look, I can't do this anymore. My mind's all over the place." And he just said, "Look, just a little bit, just keep at it for a little bit longer." And bless her, she did. And suddenly one day it broke and she sat Zazen. But what really struck me was when she told me this, I burst out laughing and I said, "It's really funny. We give people these instructions and they can't sit Zazen, but you just somehow, it's almost like Dumbo's magic feather. You just keep them at it, sitting on the cushion, just go back to the cushion. And eventually one day it comes round." And it's almost a mystery.
Yes, it is. And it raises the question also, as teachers or people who teach meditation, always, when am I giving too much? When am I being too grandmotherly and robbing that person of the chance to discover for themselves? Yeah. At the same time, speaking for the lineage which I carry, I think coming from Moore Roshi, even when I read his books, I see this is really kind of a style of giving very explicit instruction. I think some lineages are like that. Some lineages are more, have more of an approach of implicitly. You'll catch it over time. So approaches in the toolbox, so to speak.
Yeah.
But that's the biggest challenge for me. When have I said too much?
Well, as long as they keep going back to the cushion, I guess that's the good side.
Yeah, blame me if they don't.
Well, if I may, I'd like to move on to your latest book, Hidden Zen. Hidden Zen Practices for Sudden Awakening and Embodied Realization, which the reason that obviously we're having this interview is because we reviewed the book. And, well, I reviewed the book personally. I get these books sent to us, obviously, for review. And when I saw this, I thought, I'm going to review this for myself instead of farming it out to someone else, because obviously I'd come across some of this through the work of Master Hakuin. Those people who are familiar with the Trevor Leggett A Tiger's Cave, or sometimes known as the Second Zen Reader, it has this chapter in which is it's a chapter written by Master Hakuin called Yasenkena, I think, if my pronunciation is correct, which gives the story of how he came into contact with this. And although I was familiar with some of the exercises, the classic duck egg melting of the cream that melts through the body, and keeping the warmth in the lower half of the body and the upper part of the body cool, I was not at all aware that there was as it were, a whole well, that was just the tip of an iceberg, really. So it was a great revelation to come across this. But so that's why I was fascinated by it. But I'd like to really start by asking you, what prompted you to write this book?
And I talk about that a bit in the beginning of the book, as you know. I guess the main reason was that with my exposure to Zen in the West, which is not great, honestly. I've had some exposure to Chinese Chan and some Korean Zen groups, and of course some of the Japanese Zen lineage groups here in the United States, which are primarily Soto and Sambo Zen groups. Not much Rinzai Zen here, but in those contexts, the stuff that I was familiar with from my own teachers, the things that are in Hidden Zen that they gave as basically oral instruction in the Doksan room or during Teisho, and elaboration on Hakumin's methods, for example, like the cream method you mentioned, Nanson no Ho. I saw that the other groups, even the other Rinzai groups, didn't seem to have a lot of this material. And I don't know what all of the reasons are for that. It may go back again to that simple fact that some lineages, things are taught more explicitly, some it's more implicit and you catch it over time. But for better or worse, my experience was that these things were taught explicitly, and I felt like they were worth sharing. There's also a lot of commonality between Rinzai Zen practice as I've experienced it, and even some other traditions of practice. Have in mind specifically Tibetan Dzogchen, for example. The indispensable role of the teacher as the one who points out so-called true nature, or who, Zen we say, the actions of direct pointing. I think a lot of Zen folks, or at least the ones that I have encountered, viewed those famous words attributed to Bodhidharma, that Zen is a direct pointing at the human mind, seeing your nature, becoming Buddha, as kind of a general descriptor of Zen. But my experience of it was more than that. They are concrete methods, concrete forms or actions, practices used by the teacher to effect that. So when I saw that, again, for whatever reason, my experience was a little different than what other folks seem to have. I felt like I should get it out there. And, our lineage is not widespread, not a lot of people in it. If writing them down in a book means that they survive, even if our lineage dies out, then that's another thing I thought worthwhile to do. Yeah, so it's really as simple as that. I guess a desire to share and to say that the Rinzai Zen tradition has such rich treasures of practice. So many, again, tools in the toolbox, so to speak.
Yeah.
That we should be aware of that, and we should share them, and we should use them.
Yeah, I must admit, and I think that was certainly something that I felt was very refreshing about this book, because I have a little bit of a soapbox thing on this, which I won't go into, I promise. But a little bit that Zen. Well, it's not just with Zen, but with Buddhism in the West, that we have a great emphasis on, the image of a figure underneath a tree meditating, and that's it, And I know certainly with Soto Zen and Master Dogen, he's famous for that method. But there's an awful lot of things that go unspoken that probably, to the people that Dogen was speaking to, was just taken for granted, things like devotional practices, etc. And people often don't necessarily associate a devotional practice with Zen training, for example. And it was just really interesting for me, because as I read the book, and in the introduction, you do say, one of the reasons is that that there's a certain bareness in Zen practice in the West, i.e. that some things do appear to be missing. And it's not that they're missing, but perhaps in Japan or in China, when it was Chan, these things were just taken for granted because, that was the way people lived. And you went to the temple and your family was connected with the temple, and you chanted for your ancestors, and, you make devotions to the Buddhas and the Bodhisattvas, and, you ask Manjushri to help you pass your driving test. And these things would and again, I come from a Catholic background, and I remember my granny, and my mother used to pray to Saint Anthony if she lost something. That was normal. That was very normal. But there's a faith behind that that perhaps doesn't always carry over or translate when things come, when Zen comes to the West, and sometimes when Buddhism comes west. Because in some ways Buddhism has, and we can talk about it a little bit later, but it's been sort of incorporated in with a certain sort of humanistic element and non-spiritual element as well, and which I think has come quite to the fore with secular Buddhism and the secular mindfulness movement, almost a victim of their own success, personally. Anyway, without going sort of further into that, so yes, so looking at going back to the book, to Hidden Zen, and this idea of working with, as it were, not with something intellectual, but with the coming into the presence of the body energy itself, and really sort of cultivating that. I have to say, I found that really refreshing. And just, if I can say as well, although you give a very rounded view of this training, not just for lay practitioners, but for those people who are involved in Sanzen training and for Zen teachers as well. And I would say read the whole book, even if you're never going to be a Zen teacher. Just read the whole book because it's very useful. But I must admit, some of those early exercises with the abdomen and the obi, and keeping the breath in the body, were really helpful for giving that groundedness for the Zazen. And the interesting thing was, it was something that I had experienced, but I'd never heard anybody talk about it in that very concrete, formalized way. So it really came as quite a surprise that this existed. What sort of response have you had from other Zen lineages and Chan lineages, people that because I know obviously you've done interviews on this book. What has been the response to this revelation, or to this information?
Oh, I mean, if the response has not been positive, no one has had the guts to tell me. Most people have said appreciate it. There may be some.
You're obviously not looking at your Twitter feed then.
No.
That's where it all happens.
Quite active on. Yeah, and Reddit. I stay away from Reddit. That's for sure.
Yeah, very wise. Sorry, go on.
No. I think the response has been positive. I have had a little indication from a few folks that they felt a little disappointed that they had never learned this stuff or heard this stuff before. And again, I just tried to remind them that it's not that it was lacking, but again, maybe some lineages are more explicit with it. So if that's helpful for you, well, now you have the information. So feel free to use it. Of course, communicate with your teacher as you integrate it. But I think what it all points back to, and what I really want to stress about Zen in general, is it doesn't exist without the relationship with the teacher. And most of what's important in Zen training has always been transmitted through what we call kuden, or oral instruction. That's still as indispensable as it always was. And that's why we say that Sanzen is really the central method of Rinzai Zen. Of course, Zazen is a core practice, but Sanzen is where the flint hits the steel, so to speak, and the sparks fly. So that's the place that the teacher's own practical knowledge, hard won through years of their own training, comes out spontaneously. And that's the kind of stuff I tried to write down because I thought it was worth sharing. I hope people appreciate it. I hope it's useful for them. If so, that's enough. That's enough for me. But,
I would certainly say so.
If people come away from it thinking, oh, Rinzai Zen is a little more rich than I thought, or we have a lot of stuff I didn't realize we had, that's enough. That makes me happy.
Yeah. I mean, certainly, I just to sort of echo what you said. I mean, certainly I picked up from the book, you were very clear about the importance of the teacher-student relationship as well, and that this should be integrated with that, if at all. But I have to say, I think anybody who is practicing meditation, whether you're in the Rinzai Zen tradition or not, could certainly benefit from those first exercises that you give in the book, the early exercises. Even if you don't really go any further than that, I think they're tremendously grounding for, for people who are regularly practicing seated meditation.
Yeah, I think it's very important. And, just to give an example of how important that the personal encounter with the teacher is, of course, you're familiar with the famous Rinzai master Bankei.
Yes.
Whose talks have been translated. He's become quite a popular figure among some Western Zen folks because he was somewhat iconoclastic, or they perceive him to be so. And he seemed to sort of not stress method or form. It appeals to folks
a certain temperament,
who have a certain temperament. And if you read his his talks, which have been translated, you get that impression. But what people don't know, a lot of people don't know, the people who were actually face to face with Bankei, living with him in his temple, the temples were known for the severity of the training. They sat a lot. They were not permitted to lie down for 90 days at a time. They did whole ango, not lying down to sleep. And Bankei was there with them. And you don't see that in the talks. The talks were delivered to primarily to lay people and have a very hopeful and open tone. But the actual stuff he was transmitting to the people in front of him, face to face with him, was extremely rigorous. And that's the danger of dispensing with the face-to-face teacher relationship. We miss the meat, or the real essence of the practice that fits our own bodies and that can be prescribed to us to fit our conditions. If we just go on generalities, reading talks that weren't, that were delivered to general folks, not to us, specifically in Zanzen, we might not get the medicine we need, and we might not get the detail of instruction that we need. So I always use Bankei as an example because the reality of Bankei's training that he gave to his students is somewhat different than you catch from reading the books. So please, everyone, go ask your teachers what you should do. That's the lesson.
I mean, I think that's something that can't be said overstressed. That it's very easy to take these sermons out of context. So that's important. I wanted to ask you actually, because one thing that you don't mention too much in the book, which is the history of this. Do you know much about where this came from? I mean, did it come from Hakuin? Did it pre-exist in Zen before then? Does it come from Taoism? Does it, other influences from other countries and so on?
Well, this kind of training, so specifically the kind of internal training or the breath training, what we call Tonden Soku, the breathing methods centered on the navel energy center and so on, which the book gives quite a bit of instruction about. We know that an essentially identical method exists in Indo-Tibetan training. So-called vase breathing in the Tibetan tradition is essentially identical in body usage. We know that from the early records of Rinzai Zen in Japan, from Shonan Katoroku, for example, translated by Leggett actually as the Samurai Zen or the Samurai Koans or something like that.
The Samurai Koans,
Samurai Koans. Wonderful, wonderful text. Again, a great service which he did for us. Some of the episodes in those records, so those are records of the early days of Rinzai Zen, Kamakura period, when many Chinese masters and monks emigrated to Japan. Of course, Japanese were going to China and coming back too. But in those records, we see that the Chinese masters and monks who came to Japan had an abiding concern with this so-called cultivation of the hara, the tanden, and expressed through things like the katsu, the shout, and in general, just again, what we call the kiai, the energetic intensity and vibration of the training manifested through that kind of internal cultivation. We see it even in those early records. So I cannot say where it comes from definitively, except that we know it was in India. We know it went to other places besides China and Japan. We know that the Chinese got it. We know that the Japanese got it from the Chinese. So I tend to say that it comes from India, Of course, Taoism has some similar training, but the old sort of trope about, well, Zen is just kind of like Taoism mixed with Buddhism. We know that that's not true now. The effect or the influence of Taoism on Zen was pretty minimal in terms of practice and doctrine, whereas the effect of Buddhism in China on Taoism was huge, tremendous. That's the current consensus. So
right.
Maybe the Taoists got it from us.
I'll
or,
just, yeah.
It's a joke.
But no, I was going to say,
safe to say that they arrived at the same place.
Okay, it's an interesting point. I don't know whether you've come across. There's a new book by David Hinton called China Root, where he's trying to argue that Zen is an offshoot of Buddhism. Have you come? You sounds like you've heard of the book.
Yeah, we've had quite a bit of discussion about it too. I was actually surprised to see the book because it's an idea which no scholar takes seriously anymore. It's a popular idea that someone like Alan Watts, for example, sort of promoted, but it's not. There's no historical basis for it, and I think a danger of learning and translating Chinese without also having a background in Buddhist studies and practicing, and also learning Sanskrit and understanding the process of how the Buddhist teachings were transmitted to the Chinese and the translation process that went on and so on. Without that background, it's easy to come to mistaken conclusions.
Okay, I was just curious. As I say, we reviewed that too quite recently. I also have to agree as well. I wasn't convinced by that. But that does actually bring me on to another subject, which is the migration of Buddhism from place to place. Because we know, obviously, that Buddhism, began entering into China, I think, more or less the first century of the Common Era. But it took about 400 years before the Chinese were able to produce their own definitive Chinese Buddhist schools, of which obviously Chan was one of them as well. And obviously here in the West, we are facing a similar situation. And probably like the Chinese, who thought that Buddhism was just another form of Taoism, that idea goes back a long way, and therefore had to sort of relearn it again. Obviously, mistakes will be made here in the West. One of the things that interested me about this book and got me thinking is also something that obviously, as someone who has done some Zen training as well, that has occurred to me from time to time before, and that is that, when you look, for example, at the Mumon Kan and you see, a two-line koan, how it goes from, two sentences in a book to Satori in an individual. What is the theory of mind and body and environment, that can create, that bridges those two events? Because, Western psychology, it can't model that. It doesn't, and yet nobody seems to. I've never seen anybody asking, how is this possible? How is koan training even possible? How can it even possibly work? We have no theory we have no model to explain that. And of course, I think one fascinating thing about this book, Hidden Zen, is that there's a sort of theory of mind, if I can put it like that, or theory of body mind and body mind environment, where everything is very tied up. Obviously, everything is very joined up, which is classic Buddhism, obviously, that it relies on for it to make sense and to work, and that perhaps that for us in the West, who still live in this mind-body split, Cartesian dualism, as it's classically known, it hasn't actually been acknowledged that this is a very different way of seeing oneself and oneself in the world and oneself in the body, mind, and so on. And I just wondered if you could say a little something about how you think about these things.
Yeah, and if we talk about a Western psychological understanding, for example, or even a secular Buddhist approach, we have to say even a bit more that it's not just Western, and it's not just secular, or it's not just sort of coming from a Cartesian assumptions. I think it's essentially materialist in its view. Consciousness,
Yeah.
mind is viewed as the epiphenomenon of the brain, or
Yeah.
produced by matter and destroyed when the brain dies. So that right there is a completely different assumption than the Buddhist one, in that we have to say that everything is a manifestation of a so-called one mind, or matter itself is a result of a consciousness rather than the other way around. That might be another way to say it. So I don't know how much I can speak to that, because I kind of see myself more and more, perhaps sharing some of your soapboxes, I suspect, but I find myself more and more casting myself as, well, you're really a traditional Buddhist. You didn't know you really are. And when I have discussions with folks about these issues, I find myself standing on the traditional Buddhist assumptions of pre-birth and post-mortem continuity, or the process of becoming, and so on. To me, those ideas are foundational to Buddha Dharma and to Buddhist practice. Otherwise, I'm not sure why we would be doing it.
Yeah.
So because of that sort of traditional bent is what you call it, it could be called bias or a prejudice that I have. When I explain these things, like what happens in koan training, what happens in sanzen, I can only fall back on the traditional explanations. So we talk about sanzen as entering the ba, the energetic field, or the quality of existence that comes out from someone who has realization, has the power to affect those who enter into it. And somehow through that encounter, the mind of the teacher and the mind of the student can come to match through a kind of resonance. That's a traditional explanation, but it matches my experience. So I'm afraid I don't have a more modern way to describe it yet. I perhaps should try to hit on something, but that's how I talk to my students. I use that traditional terminology. And when we talk about koan training, of course, a two-line koan, but the words could be the gateway. For example, Joshu said, Mu, what was the state of Joshu at the moment he said that? It doesn't help us to break down the meaning of the word in the Chinese and well, he was negating or he was affirming. That's not the point of the practice, as you well know. But how does the samadhi condition allow us to enter into the state of mind of Joshu so that we could give our own answer? The only way I can explain that is that there is the kind of a field of influence in the encounter with the teacher that enables us or opens that door to us. And that's what Sanzen rests upon. Sanzen is when you go into the Sanzen room, of course, your teacher's there, each have names, you each have personalities, but from another way of seeing, that's completely the Buddha in front of me. From another way of seeing, it's just two human beings with no names and no personalities, mutually exploring the Dharma. We have so many ways to use that relationship. But at the end of the day, the teacher has to be inhabiting that state of the koan, whether it's Tozan or Jutsu or whatever, has to be embodying it and manifesting it in that encounter. If the teacher falls out from that samadhi, it's not sanzen. If that condition is there, that so-called ba exists, the student could resonate with it. I go on and on about these things using the same kinds of descriptions. People get tired of it, I'm sure, but I don't know how else to describe it, honestly.
No, that's fine. We're not tired of it, so that I'm not tired of it, so that's fine. Just to say, what you said just reminded me of something. Back in the 1990s, Soko Morinaga Roshi, who was the head monk at the time that Venerable Myokyoni was training in Daitokuji, he used to come and he gave a series of commentaries on the koans of the Mumonkan over about 10, 12 years. And I was very fortunate to be in the audience for some of those. And one of the things I remember having a bit of a mini realization, because he used to start off, as the classic Teisho, you'd read the original in Japanese, the koan, and then the Mumon's comment, and then the verse, and then he would begin to speak. And he just had this incredible way. You could see that as he began to speak about this, he would it's almost like the koan was unfolding. It would grow into a garden almost, that it became alive. He would tell you a little bit about the biography of the people involved and what China was like at that time, and the oak tree in the garden, or the flax, 3 pounds of flax or whatever, that they grew flax in the area, and so this is what was it. But it was just, that sounds very reductionist, but actually the way he wove this together, there was an incredible life to this. And I think it's almost as if that we were looking at this koan and he was talking about it, and this thing was just unfolding before our eyes. And by the end of it, there was this amazing sense of profundity that had arisen. I couldn't tell you, I couldn't put it into a sentence, but my goodness, the presence of something was palpable, and this realization that the koan had become a living thing. It was actually a living force. And I think, you mentioned the idea of the force field or the Buddha field, which is, of course, a teaching that the Buddhas have this area of influence called the Buddha field, and that this is actually a real thing, and it influences things that walk within it, so to speak. So yes, what you're saying does make sense. Thank you.
I like that we agree about almost everything.
Yeah, well, don't worry. I'm sure we'll find something. Well, that's to be honest. That's no. I mean, to be honest, because people can have differences about tea and coffee or whatever, but what we're talking about, and we both agree on this. This is the Dharma coming west is something that is tremendously important, and like the Chinese, we will get things wrong about it, which I think is okay, as long as when you recognize that it's wrong and it's not working, you can let it go and come back and retrace one's steps. And I'd like to just sort of ask you, because here we are at the, moving into 2021, and the Dharma has come west, and, there have been problems with it, let's be honest, and not just in Zen either. What are the things that, from your experience, that we need to get right if Buddhism is to put down good roots in the West? What is it that we have to be careful of? What are your tips?
Not to be in a rush, first of all. I think that there has been a rush in some corners, especially of the Zen world, to want to change, again, forms too quickly. Oftentimes before those forms have been mastered, and oftentimes before the principles that the forms transmit have really been grasped. And people, the reason given for that is, we have to make it relevant to our culture, has to fit the place where it's landed. But it really is, to me, it smacks of a kind of Orientalism that, we are going to fix this. We can make it modern, and some of that benighted superstitious stuff of those kind of interesting but sort of backward Asian people, now that it's here, we're gonna get it all sorted out. And yeah, I really think that's what's underpinning a lot of it. One of my teachers said that, lovely image, when you move a tree, you don't yank it out and then replant it. You take the dirt that's around the roots like a ball, and then you replant it, and that old dirt goes into the new ground and slowly can combine. He said that was a good image for how we should view the sort of acculturation of Buddhism into the West. And I think it's a good one. There's no rush. I mean, again, many Zen teachers will talk endlessly about how they need to change Buddhism, but it's already changed because they're the bodies doing it. We wear the Zen robes. And
Sorry, as ever, the other world hold on. There we go. No Thank you. Sorry, do continue.
A different Ba is intruding on you.
Indeed. Do go on.
What I want to say is, like, when we look at the robes that the ordained people wear, right? We have the Keso, the Raksu, which comes from India, or represents the original kasaya, the Buddhist robe. Then we have the black koromo, which comes from China. Underneath that, we have the kimono, which comes from Japan. So we have the sort of archaeological layers of the transmission of Buddhism just in the clothes we wear. But I often joke, but the boxers are made in USA, or this body was born here. This is the body mind doing the practice. What do I need to change? The fundamental orientation already has come from here. So our job should be to look at the forms we've inherited and master them in our bodies, really understand how they were used. Something like the clothing is not just symbolism and aesthetics, but for example, as I describe in my book, we have a way of using that belt, which is really useful for our training. And we should know that before we throw it out and say, oh, just wear blue jeans. So the rush to throw things out, to me, seems to be occurring without that kind of mastery first happening. And again, I'll say it again, I think coming from a little bit of a, even if it's unconscious, sort of Orientalist idea that, my job as a Westerner is to improve this stuff, bring it into accord with our sort of superior way of doing things. And I think that's it's bull, and we need to ease up a little bit, let it happen organically and naturally.
Yeah, perhaps a classic case of emptying the teacup.
Yeah, or exactly. I'm thinking of something else to say because I get so riled up about this subject, but I'll let it sit at that.
No, I do too. And as I say, certainly for me personally, I think that what really got my own thoughts along this line, and realizing that in fact this is actually quite an important issue for us here in the West. A little bit of self-examination on that is the rise of the secular movement, but certainly our ability. I mean, because we did this with yoga. I grew up in the 70s, and I remember practicing with the first books on yoga in the 70s, and we sort of just cut and paste something from a living tradition and put it into a leisure center, basically, and a little bit, obviously, meditation and mindfulness, the same thing can happen. And of course, people say, a lot of people are having benefit from this, and absolutely they are. And not trying to be disingenuous or take away from that. But yes, there seems to be this shadow cast that says, this is the bit that matters. We know that the other stuff, karma, the slightly awkward and embarrassing stuff, really, we can leave that to one side because it's not really important. And I think, as you're saying, if I think that's a really good point about moving slowly, taking time, examining things carefully, not throwing things out because they don't appear to be useful, respecting another tradition, and not, as it were, walking carelessly all over something, thinking that we know what's important and what isn't. Yeah, there's a lot of humility needed around this, I think, and it's obviously going to be a process that we'll have to relearn and relearn, I suspect.
And I think honesty and integrity is important in that someone can call themselves a secular Buddhist, negate karma, they negate the warnings about extreme views of materialism or annihilationism that exist in Buddha Dharma. They negate whole foundational pillars of the Buddhist analysis of the human condition and prescription for that. That's fine. Anyone can do that. Everyone is free to do that. But why call yourself a Buddhist? It would have more honesty, and there would be more integrity to say, I'm influenced by Buddhism. I've taken some things from Buddhist teaching and practice that appeal to me, but I'm doing my own thing. Rather than try to use the word Zen or Buddhism. Why? Because they have a certain marketing cachet. It seems rather crass to me and less than honest.
Yes, I think less than honest, definitely. I would definitely go there. Listen, I've kept you quite a bit already. But before you go, I wanted to ask, because obviously we're coming up towards New Year, moving into 2021. It's been a difficult year for many people and globally. And curiously, in a way, obviously the Buddha's teachings, suffering I teach, and the way out of suffering. And in a curious way, we've been doing it together. In our different continents, we've been affected by this, and there's going to be quite a lot of fallout from this as well. Economically, I know people who've lost their job, etc., and so forth. People have had an uncertain year, and it looks like the year ahead is also going to be fairly uncertain. Big question, but what sort of tips and hints, what could you give for people who perhaps are feeling anxious going forward into the future, facing uncertainty? What can you give them?
Oh, nothing terribly comforting, I'm sure. Well, the Buddha's, again, sort of analysis of our situation was not really wrong. And we may feel safe or stable or secure in some circumstances, but they're going to change quickly. There is no time in human history when we weren't subject to this kind of thing, and it's going to continue. So knowing that, how can we step forward in accordance with our bodhisattva vows and use our practice to just help the people that are around us? I mean, I think the proactive, positive way to deal with the situation is to take our vows very seriously. And there's no way we're going to allay all of the suffering, and there's no way we can really prevent sort of horrible events from happening. We certainly do our best to order the world as the way that we see, and to somehow progress towards a more peaceful world, one hopes. But no matter what, there's the next pandemic's coming after this one. The next disaster's coming after that one. And it has always been that way. But finding ourselves in the middle of that and saying, well, I've taken the bodhisattva vows. What do I do today for the people who are around me to compassionately aid them in some even very small way? We just had a snowstorm here. And I see on the local town Facebook site, people offering to shovel each other's driveways. If you need help, let me know. That's a bodhisattva activity. And I don't think we need to think much bigger than that in some ways. What's that kind of kindness that we can extend to the people around us? I think of the Boy Scouts had the idea of doing a good deed a day. Yeah. That's not a bad way to face 2021. And of course, practice your hearts out. Practice your hearts out. Yeah. Because that is a wise way to use the human existence.
So take your time and think community. Stay local.
Be kind, and be kind yourself. Take care of yourself, of course. But step out from the dark bubble of pandemic mind and see what does a person down the street need.
Cool. Okay.
Who's buying the person groceries, right?
Yeah.
That kind of thing.
Yeah. That's important. Yeah. No, I think that's excellent advice. Thank you very much.
I don't know what else to say. So.
No. I think that's. I think that is it. I think the cure for pandemic mind is to let it go and, as you said, see what the person down the streets needs. And
as a bodhisattvas, we vow. We vow as bodhisattvas to be reborn in the place where we're needed, not in the place that's ideal.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much. Can I just say
thank you so much.
Just before we go, I do need to ask you: is there anything else in the pipeline?
You mean in terms of publications?
Publications, talks, I don't know, anything online that you're doing? Yeah, so, Korinji has a Patreon page where I do a lot of video instruction, and a lot of the things which are in Hidden Zen are I actually teach there using video. I'm actually involved with, I don't want to give the name yet, but could be within the next few months, we'll announce involvement with another online portal, which is actually trying to bring together meditation teachers from different traditions
to offer online courses and even sort of one-on-one instructional consultations, things like that. That might be kind of a neat way to reach people. Okay. So I'm looking forward to that. But in terms of the publications, I'm fishing around for ideas right now. So if anyone has one, please let me know.
Okay, surviving a pandemic, baby. I don't know. Well, we will certainly link to the Korinji website and also to your Patreon page. Then, in that case, in the show notes to this, can I just say it's been really lovely talking to you. Thanks very much for giving up your time to come and talk to us. And yeah, well, when that next book comes out, we may be in touch again and have you on the show. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you so much. I want to thank you again also for everything, and Zen Gateway is a website, and I really want to stress to people that the Zen Center in London, Shobuan, has done a huge service with the publications, especially that it continues to make available. Torei's Inexhaustible Lamp is a required reading text for all Rinzai Zen students. Please go to that website and order it because it's the only place it's available now, and it's very reasonably priced. What an amazing thing.
Thank you. Yes. Well, and also the advice is read it slowly as well.
Yes. Read it once a year, every year for the rest of your life.
Indeed. All right. Thank you very much.